Welcome to Moth Magic, an introduction to moths. We've already looked in parts 1, 2, and 3 at what a moth is, what the diversity of them is like, what their survival strategies are. This particular episode will look at ecology and conservation, and then we have a look at ways to record moths. So in ecology and conservation, we'll be looking back at the concepts of moths in the web of life, but filling in some of the details that we kind of glossed over in part 3. And then we take a look at how wildlife conservation uses this information to identify areas for conservation actions through ecology processes. So, web of life. Well, we looked at consumers and producers in a rather hierarchical fashion last time round, with primary consumption by Lepidoptera larvae, and then consumption of the larvae and of the adults, and also at the process of pollination, which is kind of giving you a bit more of a web rather than just a hierarchy. Well, this time we're going to look in more detail, take the larvae as the primary focus, and see where they all fit together, sort of, what kind of a web we construct. So, larva. Now we know from the last time round that nutrient flow through the trophic gills basically starts with the primary producers and goes through to the secondary consumers, with the moth larvae providing the main consumption of primary produce, changing it into a little protein package that is then consumed by secondary consumers. Of course, those that don't get eaten turn into moths, as we know them, and they then get eaten, of course, with the caveat, I guess, that once all of the nutrients are produced and then consumed at the primary level, consumed then at secondary level, they get dumped back to the primary producers as poo and urine. Yeah, so there's a cycle there, a flow of nutrients. However, this is not the only cycle that's involved in this particular web. Next major component is that of pollination, because without not just the day shift of bees, but the night shift of moths and of some beetles and other invertebrates and some mammals, the moths are the main component, you get no primary producers. So pollination is major importance for us, because if we don't have pollinators, we don't have food from fruit and vegetables. There are some slightly weird and wacky sidetracks, but it's still important as a particular guild. And we come back to the symbiotic mutualism later as an example. But in effect, it takes a particular cycle where one species interacts with another in such a way that both can't live without each other. So in this particular instance, there's a symbiotic relationship between a plant and a moth species that involves at least 3, perhaps 4 of the guilds that we've been looking at. Another major group, major, it's probably the most important group of the lot, frankly, is the recyclers. Because without them, everything that gets produced and consumed would pile up in such a way that actually all the nutrient would eventually run out. So without the recyclers to take dead animals, to take all the nasty bits and pieces and leftovers of primary producers, then nothing's recycled. So it's an incredibly important part of the system. Another major component, to which I don't really do justice here in any way, shape, or form, is that of the parasite role. Suffice to say, for now, it's important, and of course it helps stuff get back to the recyclers. Now let's take this in terms of one messy looking web that we've ended up with in terms of examples, and you'll see why I've built it as I have. So keeping the guilds in place, let's work our way round the house. Let's start with the pollinators. We've talked that they're already important. Put them into their spot. Primary producers, well, there are quite a lot of examples. I'll go through them quickly. We have fungi. We have plants, of course. We have algae, major component of primary production. Not too big in the Lepidoptera, but there are still Lepidoptera that use algae. And perhaps a little less understood, but still nonetheless very important, is the role of the lichen, or lichen as you like, which actually they are a combination of fungus and algae to make their own symbiotic mutualistic relationship. What else? Well, parasites, we'll get there in a mo. Next up, an example of the symbiotic relationship. This is the plant family, Phylanthaceae, and the moth genus Epicephala. They are gracilarid moths, most of which in this group are leaf miners, but this lot are seed predators on Phylanthaceae. So they eat the seeds. But actually that is a reward because the adults pollinate the flowers, and they're the only things that pollinate the flowers of Phylanthaceae. So without the pollinators, the plants can't produce the seeds. Without the seeds, no moths. So it's a mutually inclusive grouping of two different organisms reliant upon each other. Now, reliance. This is a one-way shop. Parasites, many of which utilize, in fact, most Lepidoptera species. Sometimes there's one particular parasite that feeds off a particular host. Some are much more generalist and will use many different hosts. But it's a one-way show. The parasite lays its egg on the caterpillar or in the caterpillar, and then slowly eats the caterpillar from the inside out. Some are so tiny that they actually, instead of using the caterpillar as a host, will use the egg as a host. That's not the whole story though, because actually moths get a bit of their own back sometimes. There is a whole family of moths, the Epipyropidae, who parasitize fulguroid bugs. And it's actually quite an important group because the fulguroid bugs are pest species on a lot of tropical fruit, particularly longan and lychee in this part of the world in Hong Kong. And what they do, the larvae actually live jockey style on the back, the abdomen of the bug, underneath its wings. And they basically suck the thing dry slowly. So it keeps the pest numbers under control. A little bit different. And from parasites, I suppose it's one step to recycling because the parasites are doing it on live stuff. Recyclers recycle material on dead stuff. Now, for us, dead stuff is not always as important as we would like to think it is, but we use dead things a lot. Think of clothes. Almost all natural fiber, cotton in particular, is something that we've used for our own benefit, furs as well. But recycling is the name of the game for a lot of moth species, and it's what they've evolved to do. So why should we complain when actually what they're doing, recycling our clothes, is what comes naturally to them? We just have to be a bit more careful with how we store things. The same goes with our food. A lot of our stored foods are, in effect, material awaiting recycling. Now, we would recycle it as food for ourselves if we get the chance, but so would some of these moth species. What about other options? Predators of butterflies and moths, and particularly in moths. We know that bats predate moths. We know that birds predate moths, and birds are an important component, both in terms of the abundance and in terms of their consumption. So much so that some species of moth basically are the sole reason birds can reproduce. So without the moths, no birds. But there are many other secondary and tertiary consumers that rely on the moths too. A good number of snake species use Lepidoptera larvae and pupae as food, as do spiders. In fact, spiders are incredibly important at keeping population levels manageable so that we don't get overwhelmed with lots of moths. Also mantis and tiger beetles. In fact, lots of different beetle families. Bugs get a bit of their own back. Assassin bugs and reduvid bugs are very much predators of Lepidoptera larvae and pupae, and even eggs for small ones. And for day-flying Lepidoptera, not just the butterflies, but many of the smaller diurnal moths, they have to keep a very keen eye open for odonates, the damselflies and the dragonflies. Top gun predators. So there you are, a few examples of fairly well-known things. The last example I'm going to give is not so well-known, but is very wacky indeed. This is a fungus. It's the genus Cordyceps, and some cordyceps are highly prized as food or even as traditional medicines. But there are thousands upon thousands of species of cordyceps. Each cordyceps special because it's unique to a particular insect, and sometimes even a particular stage of the insect's life cycle. So this cordyceps feeds on a hawk moth pupa. What we see is only the fruiting body. The rest of the fungus is inside, having killed the pupa already. So actually, cordyceps is not just a consumer, but a recycler as well. All fascinating stuff. But all these components of the various trophic guilds help us build up an understanding of what is needed to help conserve, because without understanding the ecology, we have no chance of conserving the species. Let's put a different spin on it. In part 3, we looked at an example of nutrient flow in a cyclical process via the caterpillars and their output forming nutrient for plant growth, and then the absorption of decaying plants back to the caterpillar around. Take a slightly different perspective, using what we call niche occupancy to look at gaining an understanding on how these ecological niches give rise to species diversity and how species are distributed, and then how this impacts on our approach to conservation of both species and of habitats. So here we go. One larva, one habitat system. This is another woodland. It is a very simplistic woodland because it's in a temperate region with actually one dominant tree species. Now, the larvae, if they're using all the niches available to them, could be pretty much anywhere. So that means under the ground, on the tree trunk, on the sunny side, on the tree trunk, on the shaded side, because there's a difference. On the sunny side, it dries out faster. On the shaded side, there may be mosses growing in a damper situation. Further up the tree trunk, branches coming out. It's windier. There's more sun, there's more light, it's warmer. There's less humidity. So you may have different species higher up the tree trunk, and then you have on the branches motion, Then you have on the smaller branches, you have the leaves. And then in the leaf, maybe inside rather than on, you have another caterpillar. And then higher up in the tree canopy, because it's even windier and even drier and even more sun exposed, you may have a different range of species using that different set of niches. So one tree can support many niches. That's just one tree. If you take all the forest habitats around the world, there are many thousands of tree species. So that is just with trees, many thousands of niches available. If you add in herbs, ferns, climbers, and all the other primary producers found in forests or in other habitats, that gives us hundreds of thousands or maybe millions of niches that can be used by all the primary consumers. Now, obviously not all of those are going to be moth caterpillars, but a good many are. And it goes some way to explaining the incredible diversity, especially in the tropics, of the Lepidoptera. Now, niches give rise to strategy of, do I take one or do I take all? Am I a generalist or am I a specialist? So, for example, this is kidney vetch, or it's the flower and the seed of kidney vetch, and there are species that specialize on feeding in the flower and in the seed of kidney vetch. Now that might seem very specific, but actually it's even more specialist when you think that the plant itself is a specialist of alkali soils. So you only find the plant on alkali, chalk, limestone, calcareous soils, which means that you're only going to find the moth that feeds on the plant in the same habitats. If it's an acidic habitat, then you won't find the plant, so you won't find the moth. On the other hand, you might find a larva that is a generalist and feeds on a whole range of plant species. It might be one whole family, might be many families of plants. So a habitat that is comparatively complex with many different plants of perhaps a few or many different families, some species will find there's lots of food available. The generalists. The specialists, well, they might specialize on one or two of the tree species, and if their distribution of those trees in that environment, in that landscape is patchy, it's difficult for a specialist to survive. So, landscapes. How do the moths cope with the bigger picture? The answer is not so easily if humans have messed with the environment. This photo shows a classic human impacted landscape. In the foreground, you have a bit of forest that is managed. In the distance, you have an island in the loch, and then you have upland and lowland, and the upland is grazed. There's not much forest left. The lowland has almost completely been converted to agricultural land or managed forest. And you will see it's in a patchwork of habitats. Some components are connected, some components are fragmented. And how the habitat patchwork connects to each other helps determine what we term the metapopulation dynamics of a species takes place. So, for example, the geometrid moth at the top, in the middle here, it has broad wings, relatively slender body, it's highly maneuverable in flight. So it basically is adapted for forest environment. But if it's only in natural forest, it's going to have a tough time here because actually there are only tiny, tiny patches of natural forest left. And some of them are rather isolated. So from a genetic perspective, the flow of genes between these patches or any particular geometric species is restricted. And that can lead to genetic inbreeding, which reduces a species' resistance to infection and increases genetic disruption, so the species can die out very easily. In the metapopulation, that's the whole group of populations, that might mean that one particular site is viable and the others aren't, if that site is big enough to support a good population, both from numbers and from genes. But if you're isolated, like at the top of the hill here, from any other grassland site, and this only supports one small population, then the genetic inbreeding becomes a major, major problem. If you're a more robust species in terms of your build and you're adapted for open grassland habitats, human landscapes, human modified landscapes are easier to survive in. This is a species adapted for grasslands. It can fly all round, all through the patchwork of fields that are interconnected and has not such a big issue in surviving because its gene flow between populations in each of these sites is still manageable. What else can landscape tell us? Well, this is a footman moth at the top right, i.e. a lichen moth. And in environments that are heavily industrialized, where there is pollution through sulfur dioxide, you won't see large numbers of lichen moths because lichen, their host plant or host, are sensitive to pollution levels of sulfur dioxide. High sulfur dioxide levels, in effect, means low or zero numbers of lichen moths. What you can't see here is what this site looks like at night. You can infer it because we see there's a small village here and there are one or two houses dotted around. So we can assume that there will be roads between each of these habitations for humans. Some of those roads will be lit, but in the country, most aren't. But in an urban environment, then the whole place is lit up. And high light pollution is also really not a good thing for moths. Seeing ecology in action helps enormously to prepare and understand what we need to do for conservation of the insects that we're targeting. But it doesn't tell us the whole story. Some desktop work is needed. And this is where National Moth Week becomes really important. Because with moths, we've got so little long-term data, it's almost impossible to demonstrate changes in population trend. Is it becoming rare? Is it becoming common? Is it doing really well? Is it in trouble? We know that overall, there are great declines in the general numbers, the abundance of moths. Certainly compared to 1950s, when moth recording became much more commonplace with light traps, the abundance of what we see now is very low indeed. But for most species, we don't have long-term data. So getting the bigger picture with everybody contributing through citizen science is incredibly helpful to build a bigger picture of more comprehensive data set to fill in the gaps in our knowledge. And what is on screen is a case in point. This species of moth was recorded in Hong Kong in the late 1990s and not before. It was actually described in mid-2000s, but it's still only known from basically 3 meta-populations. And we don't know whether there are any interconnecting population sites. Problem is that because we do know there's lots of data for Hong Kong, we can be fairly confident that these dozen or so observations of this rather rare species is a true reflection of its rather perilous state. But for most of the species we have in the world, we don't have good data like this. So NMW, the National Moth Week, really makes a big, big difference. Every single record counts. That's all I have time for. Quickly summing up, we've been through and looked at different ecological functions of moths, where they're found through niche occupancy, that there are species that specialize, that there are species that are generalist, and we can find assemblages that are unique almost everywhere in the world. And that conservation of the species relies upon our approach to landscape level conservation that maintains processes that support life on Earth. Okay, thank you for listening in. Part 5 will be how you can take part yourselves. Until we see you then, cheerio for now.